Just another day here at the Voice of College Football, which means just another series of Ohio State and Michigan fights in the chat. But this one is different. So we appreciate you stopping by. And if you're unfamiliar with what the deep dive is, you're in for a treat, regardless of who you root for. So Ohio State fans, Michigan fans, college football fans, dig in, relax, and enjoy the metrics and the comparison here. So we got Tony Altimore, consultant, strategist, friend of our network here at the Voice of College Football, has done such an outstanding job sizing up universities, athletic programs, football departments, media influence, everything that makes these programs what they are historically and as of 2024. Tonight, we look at Ohio State and we look at Michigan. Tony, how you doing tonight?
Good, thanks. And by the way, my apologies to everybody watching. You're having a minor software issue with my camera that will be easy to fix, but not with the 2 minutes notice I had when I went to turn it on. So I got to take care of that after this.
We can hear you clear and your graphics are ready to roll. So those are the important, not that we don't want to see you, Tony.
No, the charts are far cooler than I am.
On any particular night, it would be... we would love to see you, but certainly, yes, the graphics, the numbers are much more important than either one of us. So we will get started with the Ohio State Michigan look here for tonight.
All right. Well, here we go. So some of you guys know last year, Mark and I started doing these deep dives where we took a look at all kinds of different metrics of these major schools. But we do it just from Mark's Voice of College Football universe, because these are the channels that we have here in the Voice of College Football community, are specific channels for, which represent most of the mega blue bloods of the sport. So for this year's twist, we decided to add 3 more schools who don't have channels in UCLA, Washington, and North Carolina, just because of all the relevance they have going on. And all the metrics we're going to look at tonight compare this group of schools. Now you guys are going to see they're all fantastic schools, even your rivals who you don't like. But what we really see with these is it's fascinating to compare just these institutions to each other. And that's what we're going to do tonight.
All right, Tony. Can't wait to get to the metrics. Folks, the Super Chat's available for any comments or questions that you have for Tony and or myself. But Tony has us all lined up, and we are saving the football for last. But we are going to go through some very important, again, metrics, statistics, charts that will give us a more well-rounded look at both of these fine institutions.
And the reason we like to do that is because by understanding, we can understand football teams better if we understand the universities who put out those teams and what drives their success on the field and across the board. So we're going to look at 10 different areas tonight: athletic, academic, success, budgets and resources, students and scale, athletic department, success, football, budget, all this stuff we're going to put together. And the reason we do that, and we'll give you a little spoiler, is that why is Ohio State successful? Well, I would argue that having a giant medical empire helps play a role in that. And we're going to see how that translates in a little bit. All those people go, research doesn't matter to football. It absolutely does. All right. So if you guys here in the Voice of College Football community, you know football. So we're going to get to it later. You know who won the national championships. You know who won the Heisman trophies. You know who the TV numbers. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first, let's start off with the basics. So this is our deep dive universe here of all these schools across the Big Ten, the SEC, the ACC, and West Virginia and the Big 12. And there's a couple of things here that are really interesting to notice. First one is the Carnegie classifications, which is how schools are officially rated, like based on what they do. And if it's a research school, it gets a grade from 1 to 3. 1 is the best. Every single one of these schools in Mark's Voice of College Football universe is an R1 school. That's as good as it gets. That means you are maxing out as like a great research university. And I think that says a lot, and it's something that we forget a lot, is how good these schools really are. The next line on there is AAU. So the AAU is the really, really elite invitation-only club of research universities. And another thing you notice here about this group, half of them are in the AAU. That's phenomenal. You also see their state flagship schools, their land grant schools, and they're all classified as national universities. These are all exceptional schools, every one of them, even the ones I don't like. I'm just teasing. So let's look at the schools here. Start off with, let's take a look at some ranks. So this is the U.S. News rank, which has its flaws, but it is generally considered the most used, if not the most reliable one. And we notice something here. These are, again, Michigan and Ohio State, you guys are going to see, are outstanding in everything they do, and that's not an accident. The reason they're good at sports is because they're also good at hospitals, and they're also good at physics and engineering, all those things. Ohio State President Johnson used to say that she wants the Big Ten to be the premier engineering conference of the world. And take a look here. Michigan's number 21, Ohio State 43. Again, outstanding. And then this is kind of interesting. This is the global rank that a lot of the university officials like better, the ARWU. And you see, again, this is global, so the numbers are higher. But again, you see Michigan and Ohio State relative to everybody else. It's kind of funny. On most of these, USC sits like right between Michigan and Ohio State, which is kind of funny. So you outstanding. Look at business schools. Michigan in the blue blood world has the number 1 business school. Ohio State's number 30. Also in law, among this blue blood world, Michigan has the number 1 law school. And Ohio State also a great law school, number 26. Med school. In this blue blood world, Michigan has the number 1 medical school. Ohio State tied with USC right there. So again, outstanding institutions. What do they cost? Well, Michigan is actually they're the most expensive public school, and we'll get to that and why in just a minute. But yeah, of the public schools here, Michigan is most expensive. Then the only ones more expensive are private schools: Miami, Notre Dame, and USC. Ohio State, very middle of the pack, much more affordable. So go Buckeyes for that one. What about getting in? So look at how popular they both are to applicants. Michigan, and this list here, is the number 3 most applied to school, and Ohio State is, 6? I mean, so 65,000 people applied to Ohio State, 84,000 applied to Michigan. Again, we're just looking at amazing numbers. What about who gets in and who goes? So the two numbers that they're really both, you have to look at them both when you think about admissions, are admissions rate and yield rate. So admissions rate is, how many students were accepted by the school. And then yield rate is how many of those accepted students went on to enroll at the school. So you see Michigan only accepts 17 points, and again, these are all, the Department of Education is like a year and a half behind because of the reporting time for the schools. But there's somebody angrily typing, no, it was different this semester, but just go with it. I think this is FY22, FY23. Michigan was 17.7. Ohio State let in 52.7%. And then in yield rate, and this is a really impressive number for Michigan here, 47% of the students that Michigan accepted attend. A lot of schools, again, and remember, guys, these are all great universities. There's a lot of schools that have numbers below 10% on yield rate. So Ohio State, 23%. So about 1 in 4 students that Ohio State lets in go. Michigan, it's about half. But they do have a little bit different missions in what they're trying to do. So again, both pretty good numbers. And then we've put those both here on this chart, and this shows us sort of the market power of the school. Now, with the coming the coming demographic cliff, which has to do with the declining birth rate that slowed to a stop during the recession, and all the kids then who weren't born, who aren't going to college next year, is going to be a crisis in college and college sports. So if you take a look here, Michigan is just in phenomenal position, up there with Florida, Texas, USC, Notre Dame, UCLA. Ohio State also, very, very good situations, kind of there with, Virginia Tech, Clemson, Washington. So that, again, that sort of shows that these schools are better prepared for, the cliff that's about to come. How big are they? Well, Ohio State, they're both huge, but Ohio State has 46,000 undergrads and 14,000 grad students. That's a lot. The only bigger school in the Marks universe is Texas A&M. Michigan's not too far behind, 51,000 total. So both pretty big schools. Enrollment growth is interesting. So who's getting bigger? Well, they're both getting bigger in both dimensions, which is something to be happy about. But Michigan, especially more so. Michigan's been growing more across both undergrad and grad. Ohio State has held pretty steady in grad school. But growing in undergrad. What about resources? So this is where things get really interesting. Now take a look at this number, and you're going to see there's 2 bars for each school. And there's what's called core revenue and non-core revenue. And what's fascinating for both of these schools, so core revenue is actually, I think they're expenses. My apologies. I just realized it's wrong on the chart here. It's expenses. Core expenses and core revenue both are the money that actually is involved with being a school. So tuition, professors, student services, that kind of stuff that's actually part of being a school. Non-core revenue are things you do that are sort of separate from a university, like running a giant medical empire, running massive federal research labs, those types of things that are huge money. And the more of those things you do, the richer your school is. The bigger the budget is, and that gives you the ability to do sports in school on a bigger level. The money that you have to spread across, whether if you need school money, there's more of it. And it really just the phrase "a rising tide floats all boats" comes in here, because it does. The more stuff a school has, the more powerful it is, the more independent it is, the more secure it is, the more prepared it is for the rapid changes in the future. So take a look here. Of this universe, Michigan has the second biggest budget, driven by its enormous healthcare system. And then Ohio State has the 4th biggest budget, also driven by its enormous healthcare system. So, those are 2 really big things that are really, really helpful to those 2 institutions. Now, this sort of flips it on its head, because we know these are public schools. These are the flagship schools of their state. So how much money do they really get from the state? Not as much as you think. So we just saw Michigan had how many $1 billion? Michigan's running a $10 billion budget. How much of it comes from the state of Michigan? Only $300 million. Only 3.3% of Michigan's budget comes from the state. Ohio State's at 6.2. So, Michigan's de facto as far as the state's concerned, might as well be a private school. I think Pitt gets a higher percentage of their budget from the state than Michigan. They don't even really get money from the state. So that's one thing to think about, especially for Michigan and Ohio State, is they're really not getting a lot of money from the school. You look at these other schools. Georgia's getting a third of it. Georgia and Florida State are getting a third of their budgets from the state. Tennessee's getting 30%. Nebraska's getting a quarter. Michigan's getting 3%, and Ohio State's getting 6%. So they're essentially self-funded schools. Let's look at tuition revenue. So this is an interesting piece. So again, we know that there's going to be a crisis of kids who, were not born during the recession, and so they're not going to college next year. So one of the big sort of crisis points for a lot of these schools is how much of your budget comes from tuition. So for example, in D3 especially, but there's some D1s too, where, these schools who they let everybody in and they're desperate for tuition. That's a bad position to be in. But you take a look here. Ohio State, only 12.9% of their budget comes from tuition. Michigan is 13.8. It's a little more on the core budget, but again, these schools are incredibly well positioned financially. What about research? Well, research is huge. because you get these huge research grants primarily from the government, and they have a very generous sort of overhead allowance in them that helps fund the whole school. So people who say, well, research money doesn't matter to sports. Oh, yes, it does. Because that's what helps keep the school in its state of success. And these two universities are just research powerhouses, both well over $1 billion a year. Michigan is 1.7 billion. Ohio State is 1.3 billion. And actually, Michigan would be number one. It depends on what you count about the medical stuff. Texas has sort of a weird situation with their med schools. We gave them credit for it here, even though they're not all in Austin. But I think you kind of need to, right? Because the Penn State Hospital is an in-state college, so we count that. But it's really interesting to see here. Michigan is getting, we saw their budget, $1.8 billion of that is coming in research grants. So go blue. Ohio State also huge. Now the endowment. This is another thing that really just lets a school be safe and secure financially. The endowment is it's like a trust fund essentially that is invested through combinations of traditional investment instruments as well as lots of really cool alternative investments. Usually they have phenomenal returns, and it's just this huge base of funds that sort of help fund the school in addition to its regular sources of funding. And having a huge endowment gives you flexibility. Now, for this chart, we combined a lot of different things because the accounting on these is messy with what's part of the schools, what's the parent organization. It gets a little bit messy. We try to give you what we think is the most accurate representation here. Michigan of these schools Michigan is the biggest one who did not have a state that gave it oil fields. That is where Texas and Texas A&M's money came from. It comes from oil.
Yeah.
And Texas actually has a very complicated distribution piece. Again, this is sort of like pro forma reconstructing it into what we think is a better display of the numbers. But you do. Michigan's just phenomenal. Same with Ohio State. Again, what do we always say? It goes Michigan, USC, Ohio State. Right here, Michigan, Notre Dame, USC, Ohio State on endowments too. And endowments are a thing that I think is going to grow in athletics in the coming years. Stanford is a school that really does a lot with its endowment right now. A lot of these other schools really don't. Carolina's got a decent one. Carolina's got $400 million in athletic endowment. Stanford has so much in athletic endowment. They have entire sports that are endowed, in perpetuity forever, funded forever. And you see Stanford actually got $38 million of their budget came from endowment income, which is amazing. And I think that that's a way that, really wealthy people, and particularly as schools look to make cuts, I think you'll see Olympic sports, be funded in perpetuity. If somebody gives them $50 million and now the girls volleyball team is set or something like that. Donors are interesting too. So this data is a couple years old because I don't have I have to get it from a school and I don't have the new data. But this is school-wide fundraising. So it's just to give you an idea. It's FY 16 to 20. It's a 5-year average. Because schools do capital campaigns. So 1 year has a lot of money, the next year doesn't. But so looking here at this 5-year average, this is how much each school was bringing in annual donations. So this is, alumni, local people, whoever, how much are they giving the school per year? Michigan, it's about almost $500 million. Ohio State's about $400 million. That is a ton of money. And the thing where this really relates to sports is, and I don't know the exact numbers of who gave Michigan the money this time, but I would bet that almost all of them went to football games in the Big House. Those Ohio State donors are going to games at Ohio Stadium. Because it's the place to be. It's the place to mingle. Presidents work those games. And this annual the school fundraising is very closely tied to athletics at a ton of these schools. It's huge at USC. And that's where you start to think about when schools say, hey, we need to find $20 million to pay players. Why are they just throwing $20 million at that? Well, it's because they're using this to raise $500 million. And if you can raise $500 million, you can find 20 million. So that, again, this stuff all really relates to the sport that we love, and it's part of the broader institutional issues. What about the markets? How big are the markets and the populations around these places? Well, it's hard to guess, and there's lots of different numbers you can use. We like to standardize it, especially because schools don't really line up well to DMAs and stuff like that. So this looks at state because people feel an allegiance by the state, and it looks at 50-mile radius. You can see Michigan's actually has more people in a 50-mile radius than any other blue blood outside of LA. It's pretty crazy.
Detroit, right?
Yeah. And of course, 50 miles, you probably get South. You probably get South Bend in there. You get some in Toledo and stuff like that. But yeah, so Michigan. That's a lot of these schools. People talk about markets, but look at this, guys. These schools are not. These are the elite of the blue bloods. They are not in big markets, except for like 2. And I think that really says a lot. When people talk about, oh, we bring the Dallas market. Oh, we bring the whatever city market. Well, Alabama doesn't, and they do just fine. A lot of people watch their games. Maybe you've heard. So I think that's an interesting number. And then we took something else. We said, how does that line up with interest? So we just took the Google Trends number. Google Trends gives out the score. It gives the state the score from 1 to 100, 0 to 100. It's not really percent or whatever, just it's a scoring. And you see Alabama was the top state at 100. I forget who was the bottom, maybe Alaska at 0. But it's interesting to see here the state market size versus how, again, Google Trends, not perfect, but it's just kind of interesting to see. How many people actually love college football in that state. And it's interesting to see here. You got Michigan and Ohio State, like really solidly in the middle. Pretty good positioning. Don't look to the right and see my Trojans. What about the athletic departments? So this is number of official sports. And guys, this is... there's people that are going to angrily type in the comments on this because of indoor uphill basket weaving track is different from downhill outer space basket weaving track or, whatever, but they all count as one team in the official reports. This is using the official reports of the Department of Education that they actually file that say how many sports they have. Ohio State, among these blue blood schools, Ohio State has the most, and no shock, Michigan has the second most. Ohio State officially has 33 sports. Again, they split up track and cross country and different indoor, outdoor, spring, uphill, downhill. I don't even know what all but 33 is their official number. Michigan's 29, and it's higher than everybody. I'm amazed at some of the ones that are much smaller. And national championships. Now, national championships. This is one area they're not number 1, number 2, but they're also, again, really good. So, and now this doesn't include this year because we didn't have the data published, but Michigan, 46 national championships, Ohio State, 44. And in individual athletes, Michigan, of course, has a ton. I think that's driven by swimming, maybe track too. But I think Michael Phelps has a few of those. Maybe not. I forget where I think he went to Michigan, didn't he? All right, sorry. What about Directors' Cup points? Now, Directors' Cup, some people don't like the scoring, but it's the competition between athletic departments. So if you look at the last 5 non-COVID years, Ohio State and Michigan are number 3 and number 4 among these blue blood schools. Right there, Texas, Florida, Ohio State, Michigan, USC, UCLA, Carolina. So just truly phenomenal athletic departments at both. The Buckeye Grandpa is smiling at me for this. Varsity athletes. Again, we saw they both had the most sports, so no surprise. Ohio State has the most varsity athletes of any of these schools. Thankfully, Penn State stopped consolidating their reports where they used to claim 2,200. They're back to normal now. But yeah, Ohio State has 989 varsity athletes, and Michigan has almost 900. They're enormous athletic departments. So what funds that? Well, Ohio State had the biggest budget in terms of spending last year. Now, guys, by the way, just so you guys know, when you look at these budget numbers, first of all, be wary of the revenue numbers depending on where they come from. But this is very sort of careful budget stuff. Know that these do not include things like capital expenditures, debt payments. Sometimes it depends on the source, and you really kind of want to dig into it. But for this, we tried to give you the best combined info we could. So schools that filed in one place but don't have to file in another because of reporting rules and all that, we tried to get you sort of everybody on the same page here. So, so these numbers may vary if you look at one source from another one, because only UCLA files the same numbers to everyone. Nobody else files the same two numbers to everybody else. Again, because there's some reporting issues. But Ohio State had the #1 athletic department budget among everybody, but among these blue blood schools. And what's interesting here is we take a look then at generated revenue. So generated revenue is how much money you made that didn't come from the administration or from students. And Ohio State, Michigan, again, doing phenomenally. So Ohio State came out ahead. Again, they don't always include capital expenditures. They don't include some other off-book stuff. But Ohio State came out ahead $5 million. Michigan came out ahead $4 million. Like, that's amazing. There's Big 12 schools with $40 and $50 million subsidies. And Michigan and Ohio State are not just breaking even, but coming out ahead. So athletic subsidies, something that doesn't really apply to either one of these, not really. And it doesn't really apply to many of these blue blood schools except Auburn. Ohio State, $0 from Ohio State student funds go to athletics. Michigan, it's a pittance. It's like $200K or something. It's really nothing. And of course, there's some arguments, right? Like at West Virginia, the students pay the subsidy, but then they get free football tickets. And I think at Michigan, they have to pay. So you can really always sort of make some arguments, but it's really about the edges where you see Ohio State and Michigan are not using student money to pay for this. So actually, I got called in to help a U.S. Senator's office in D.C. who's very concerned that this idea about paying players is going to turn into something that student debt is going to be financing. And the senator does not think that is a good situation. So look at Ohio State, Michigan. I mean, they have the money to pay their players, and they're not going to, tack it on the backs of their students like some of these other schools do. And not only that, Ohio State and Michigan both gave money back to the school last year. Again, accounting gets messy, but I think this is really telling. There was actually money net of whatever messy accountings you want to argue with, and people can argue with them all day. I get DMs from people. But regardless of how you want to argue the accounting, Ohio State and Michigan both sent money back from athletics to Central Campus, and that doesn't even count, like we talked about, the fundraising. Now, athletic debt is an interesting thing. So Ohio State, Michigan also have some of the most athletic debt of anybody. It's stadium renovations. As long as you can manage what you've got, it's okay, right? Because remember, schools can borrow money cheap. The reason all this private equity stuff the Big 12 is running around talking about is stupid, generally, is because schools can borrow debt cheaper than private equity firms can. Schools have unlimited access to capital for good projects. And that's why, it's okay. Ohio State, they renovated Ohio Stadium. Michigan, they renovated Michigan Stadium. They both have a lot of, bonds out on it, but that makes sense because again, it's cheap debt for the schools. Athletic revenue. This is conference revenue. Of course, they're both in Big Ten, both doing great. This is looking at ticket sales and game day revenue, as well as athletic donor giving. And the reason why I put these together is because sometimes they get a little wishy-washy between them, so I think it's good to look at them together. But, Ohio State, #1, Michigan, #3. Hard to do better. Chris O'Connor's got Texas in the middle. Good place to be. Within the athletic department spending, I think this is an interesting look at coaches' pay. This is how much goes to football, how much goes to the rest of the men's coaches, and how much goes to the women's coaches. You guys can see on most of these, just look how much football just dominates the pay. It's a lot. For whatever reason, Virginia Tech didn't report it out separately. I don't know why. And then this is football this is interesting too. So in these school budgets, they have allocated money and then they have unallocated overhead. So, the money that they say, okay, we spent this money on football. And then maybe, the admin money and the athletic director's money and the, whatever, the weight room, they just say, okay, that's for everybody. And they throw it in that unallocated overhead pile. So this says, of the money you allocated, how much went to football? How much went to basketball? And how much went to everything else combined? So Michigan and Ohio State are both spending half of their allocated money on football. Close. Michigan's 49, Ohio State's 48%. I think that's really telling. We talk about football drives the bus. Well, Ohio State's got 33 sports. One of them is half the money and all of the revenue.
So there's obviously, Tony, a formula there or a model, because even across the board, it's fairly similar in proportion, the football, the men's basketball, and then everything else.
Well, and there's also some argument here, and I'll show you this in a minute, where some people wonder, do they jimmy these numbers by throwing money into unallocated overhead? And I'll give you two examples of schools with interesting unallocated. This is the overhead spend. This is the unallocated athletic spending. So how much do they not say what sport it's for or unclassify it? So what's interesting here is Syracuse, who's not on here. John Wildhack's an awesome AD there. He's a former ESPN executive. So he makes sure that their budget is well allocated. So Syracuse only has $9 million of unallocated. LSU has $173 million unallocated. USC has $155 million unallocated. So, again, USC and LSU are just throwing all of these enormous costs, into the general fund and saying, oh, these are just for everybody. And it's kind of interesting here when you're saying, like, okay, Florida says, half of their money is not allocated to a sport. Well, Florida, learn how to do accounting. Again, sometimes there's some complicated reasons why they do it, and sometimes they just really don't care what the public thinks, because if there's one institution that does not care what the public thinks, it's USC. And so they don't care if you have no good optics into their spending, because they would tell you it's their money and you don't need optics into it. But it is an interesting dynamic. So when you guys, when you see things, and I put these charts out on Twitter, but when you see, like, how much do they spend on football? How much do they spend on baseball? It's an interesting number. But if half of your money isn't being counted in that, then maybe it's not as good a number. So I started talking to some ADs about this to ask them, hey, should I figure this by athlete or by, like, as a percentage of the rest of it? And like all good ADs, every single one has told me the same answer. They think about it for a minute, they kind of look up, think about it for another minute, and then say, let's just look at both, because they love data. so we look at both. We look at both of, what is it per athlete and what is it, per as a share of overall? Because the truth is, a lot of ADs have told me they really think that football and basketball are like half of the overhead. They have, like, this is your example. They may have the dining hall and the girls volleyball team gets to use it, but if there wasn't a football team, they wouldn't have the dining hall. So do you count the dining hall as football or not? It's an interesting thing. Buy games. So how much did you have to pay people to come lose to you? Or how much did people pay you? That's what this looks at. They're called, in the accounting books, they call it competition guarantees, but it's really, we call it, in fans, we call it buy games. So these are the checks that the schools got in FY22, FY23, I'm sorry, for going to other sports. And so the red is money you paid and the green is money you got paid. So, I think LSU played that. My guess is that's that Florida State game they played in somewhere neutral, I think. Did they do that?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
last 2 years they played Florida State, LSU in New Orleans, and then Orlando.
Okay, so my guess is that's what that is. Like I could be wrong, guys. I'm just guessing that. I don't know who or is that, maybe that's the Oregon. That may be the Oregon Georgia game that Oregon has that big check for. But you know, again, Michigan, Ohio, nobody pays Michigan and Ohio State to come to them. Very few people do. So Ohio State only had like $500,000. They had to pay out $10 million. Michigan, you know, only got in 600,000. They had to pay out 6.3 million. And this can include basketball too. Believe it or not, even tennis has some of these, although it's not usually very much. Some tennis coaches have told me that like when they want people to come to them, they have to like pay for their hotels and send a bus. So you know, there's little bits here of like Kentucky tennis is in there somewhere. Recruiting spending, you know, they're both sort of all competitive. I'm surprised Ohio State's a little low. I think that, you know, this may not be as good an accounting number, but it's kind of interesting. So football. And so this looks at that overhead share. So the light part is the allocated money, and then that top part is the overhead share. Again, a little wishy-washy how you want to allocate that, but in general, Michigan's spending about $78 million on football. Ohio State's spending about $83. And of course, then we all know from the news, Ohio State's got another $20 million to actually pay the players. So go both. Men's basketball, they're both sort of middle of the pack. And again, middle of the pack is fine because these schools are usually as good as it gets. Now let's look at football, where we all want to be. So football today. This kind of takes a look. Where's their success today? Well, on the left, we've got last year, and on the right, we've got the last 2 decades. Okay, give us a good medium term. Well, of course, both these schools, you guys know these schools are ridiculous. Ohio State has been the second best over the past 20 years. Michigan's been the 9th. And then, of course, last year, Michigan, this is using SP Plus so we can get data for everybody who wasn't ranked. Michigan, number 1, Ohio State, number 4. So hard to beat that. You know, it's like the folks that are mad at Ryan Day because he's lost like 3 conference games in his life. How does that differ from normal? Well, you know, I love this chart. You know, how do you differ from normal? But for Michigan and Ohio State, who are in such elite rarefied air, it's almost kind of silly. But we leave it in for all of them. You know, Michigan, of course, did a little better, winning the national championship. And Ohio State, you know, only finished 4th, which is worse than their average. Now if you guys go, a lot of you guys I know like the site Winsipedia. I've actually done a bunch of statistical analysis stuff where we actually found those Winsipedia composite ranks they do have a lot of statistical correlation to stuff like TV viewing and all that. So it's actually that Winsipedia overall rank is a really interesting number. So I always recommend people check it out. So I like to put that on here. And we see, so this is sort of all-time program history. Ohio State, number 4, Michigan, number 6. Hard to beat anybody but each other on that. Thinking about legacy and brand, how have you done through history? Michigan has the 3rd most national championships. Ohio State's not far behind. And if, you know, we wipe out the, you know, 1910s or 1920s or whenever some of those were, Ohio State goes back ahead. Heisman trophies. Ohio State has the 2nd most of anybody, only behind USC. And Michigan is what, 6th overall. So again, awesome places. All-time winning percentage in conference championships. They are number 1 and number 2 among the Blue Bloods.
You know what I forgot to do, Tony?
What's that?
Wink, wink to my Ohio State Michigan crowd is have you make a chart on outright Big Ten championships. That's Ohio State 24-19.
We'll have to add one. We'll add one for next time. We'll give them a shout out. Well, my favorite mark are the years. If you look at the old pack, back when it was 5, before they even got to Pack 8, when there were 5, there were years that like 3 and 4 of them shared the conference championship.
Oh yeah, there was a 4-way tie in the Big Ten in both 2000 and 1990. A 4-way tie those 2 seasons.
But they at least had 10 schools.
Yeah, well,
Like the Pac-5 with like 4 co-champions.
Well, that's like I was looking at each individual college football season starting from the beginning in 1869 to try to gauge. I was doing this about a week ago to try to gauge, okay, at what point would I really consider this to be a legitimate season? And I verified in 1869. Well, of course, there were 2 teams and there were 2 games played. Rutgers and Princeton played twice. They split the 2 games, and Rutgers still officially claims a national championship in 1869 for splitting 2 games with Princeton.
Which is even worse because they were playing soccer, because that was before McGill brought the rugby ball down to Harvard. And then Harvard and McGill played rugby, and Harvard thought it was more fun and made everyone change the rules to match rugby.
Well,
so they were playing soccer.
If I also want to get our Michigan fans riled up here, I will mention that there are 4 of their claimed national championships were won before the forward pass was in the rules. In 1913.
Virginia Tech and Kansas State would take either one of those.
They would. And Oregon would as well.
And Oregon. Oh, or I'm making the little zero gesture, guys. Which, by the way, Dan Lanning might fix. That's a really good team. Don't tell anybody I said that. It's only between you, me, and the internet. AP polls. Now, this is another interesting thing, and I love this statistic. So this is looking at in Ohio State. This is wild here too. It's
I love this statistic too, Tony.
Yeah, it's such a cool statistic. This is all-time weeks ranked, and then all-time weeks ranked number 1. And for Ohio, what I love are the schools where it's really out of whack.
Mm-hmm.
I guess Ohio State's number 1 in all-time week ranked, so we can't really say their number 1 is out of whack, but they have a lot of them. 1. Yeah, Alabama's number 1. Thanks, Saban.
And the Miami's is kind of out of whack.
No, wait, is that USC's is number 1.
Okay, in number.
No, that's Alabama. That's Alabama. I'm sorry. No, it's Alabama. It's Alabama. By the way, guys, I'm not having a good computer night. Before anybody complains, the Michigan bars were blue and the Ohio State bars were red, and I screwed up the file and they all went back to gray because it reset them to the template. So that's my bad. These charts were a lot easier to read when the Michigan ones were blue and the Ohio State ones were red. So my fault.
No, not your fault, Tony. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, it is my fault. Consensus All-Americans, another great number. Again, number 2, number 3.
Yeah.
You can't beat that.
It's impressive by both.
NFL draft picks, they're way up there. Ohio State's number 3, Michigan's number 5. Again, right there between, USC, Oklahoma, and Alabama. Good company.
Number 1 picks, Ohio State's in a
race. They're number 1
in a race with USC at number 2.
Oh,
yeah! Look at that, 91-86.
Got to get. We're probably not gonna have 5. You're probably gonna widen that lead this year based on that tape.
Well, I guess if we would go through the years that if we peeled back the years that USC was number 1, I'm guessing Ohio State has surpassed that number fairly recently. For USC,
they may have. USC is what number? They're 1 behind Notre Dame on all-time draft picks.
Wow.
What about TV numbers? Well, you guys know these are the 2 of the 3 most watched games. Again, there's not a whole lot of insight when it's like Ohio State, they're number 1. Okay, here we go. Michigan's number 2.
Yeah, and there's a pretty significant drop there after those 3 as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, a lot of that is driven by their games against each other.
Yes.
Is this regular season? Yeah, this is regular season games. So their games against each other really drive stuff. There is another number, and I put it out on Twitter before if you guys want to see it sometime. But there was an AD from a Power 2 school who saw that one of my charts had Auburn. And he's like, let's run that without like take out everybody's like biggest opponent. So we actually took out everybody's, I forget, but we took out like their top 2 opponents, their top 4 opponents or somebody, like, you know, the 4 teams they draw the most to be like, you know, how do your games that are just for you do? And it was interesting to see, you know, some of those teams like Auburn just fell off the board. But again, Michigan and Ohio State held their own. You know, people watch Rutgers when they're playing Michigan. People watch Indiana. I mean, you'll watch like Indiana, Ohio State will have like, you know, 5 million people watch. And again, some of that, if we want to be all, you know, supply side economics, is, you know, if you put it on CBS, you know, Great Aunt Lulu will watch it because she can't find the remote. But a lot of it is these teams draw people. When we did the fan base analysis a couple of years ago, in New York City, the top 4 fan bases in New York City are Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State.
Yeah.
Games picked by the networks. You know, again, you know, Notre Dame's got kind of. I like this number, guys. A lot of people trash this number, but I think this is a really valuable number. You know, how many times were your games picked by the major networks? And again, Notre Dame, it's all of them basically. In Michigan, Ohio State, it's almost all of them. But I think that's a really telling number because the networks don't have to pick your game for their slot. You know, average viewership, again, really solid. This is looking at OTA versus ESPN. Postseason TV viewership. Well, this is all about who made the playoffs. Obviously, Michigan, Ohio State doing exceptionally well. Fans. Michigan is the biggest state in the country, and they fill it. Ohio State is the 3rd biggest state in the country, and they fill it. So there's not a lot of controversy here. But I will say for some folks, and some folks who think about like, oh, I wish we would add more seats or whatever, remember that for the school, it's important to be able to sell those out and control pricing. And so you're better off maybe not being number 1, but sold out. Now, that doesn't hold to the schools who tell me that like their 35,000 people are better than UCLA's 45,000. I'm like, no, you have less. Stop. Stop, Central Florida. But again, they both average over 100% of capacity. And so attendance trends, again, it's a stupid number because they're both at capacity.
Yeah.
But you do see here, I think this is interesting. You look at, the other schools and you see, Florida State's attendance is way up from normal and UCLA's is way down. Basketball fans, both pretty good, among these groups. But I'll tell you the thing that really interested me when we were doing the labeling on these, and more basketball fans, is the national championships. And how few of these big football schools actually have a basketball national championship. And Michigan and Ohio State both have a basketball national championship, and they both have a bunch of Final Fours. So it really says something for both Michigan and Ohio State that they're up there, and these other schools are just not. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. And then basketball KenPom rankings. Again, the same thing we did before with football, looking at the last year versus the 20 year. No surprise, Ohio State had a pretty mediocre team. Michigan had a pretty bad team. And so they're both sort of on the bottom.
Number 11 for Ohio State not being considered a basketball school for the last 20 years is pretty darn good.
Yeah, right? Like, again, they're both solid. I mean, that's the thing is, when schools want to be great in everything they do, especially schools like Michigan and Ohio State. They want to be great at football. They want to be great at basketball. They want to be great at hockey. They want to be great at engineering. They want to be great at drama. They want to be great at, brain surgery. So they really want every part of the school to be great. And that's why this stuff overlaps so much. I should have put it in here, but I did a look, guys. I think you guys would find this interesting at, how much of the total athletic spend was in the power conferences. And it's an astronomical number. But here's the wild thing. That same ratio, of, the power conferences versus the rest of Division I versus Division II, Division III, that same ratio holds almost exactly in other areas of the school. The other areas of school spending, of donor money, of research grants, like these same schools are hoarding money in everything they do, whether it's, research, whether it's endowments, whether it's budgets, whether it's science, whether it's football. And you see like these schools want to be great in everything they do, and they work really hard to do it. And again, when you look at those numbers and you see they're doing the same thing in medicine that they're doing in football, sometimes football doesn't seem so ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a good point. Good point.
And it was really telling for me to sort of see that, like, okay, they're doing the same thing in medicine that they're doing in football. And then, I didn't feel quite as bad about what they spent on football. And then we'll wrap up with national leaders. And they are tied.
It's appropriate, is it?
It's appropriate. These are alumni or attendees, because it's too hard to measure alumni. People who official bios claim them to have been a former student in the U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate, the president, vice president, cabinet members, and Supreme Court justices. And again, both pretty solid in there at 7.
Now, can our folks in the chat name any of these legislators that come from either one of these schools? I would like to see that list started with, of course, Gerald Ford comes to mind.
Oh, no, this is current.
Oh, this is current. This is
okay. Right now. Or it's actually like as of 2 months ago. I forget. I think there's been a couple of congressmen who resigned since then, but this is as of when Santos was expelled. So this is post Santos. But you get but you get some funny ones, right? Like you get people that you wouldn't expect, right? Like you get Josh Hawley from Stanford. And I don't know what you think about Josh Hawley, or I don't know what you think about Stanford, but my guess is you don't see the two. Nobody sees the two of them together, but they're together.
Yeah.
Speaking of Stanford, they lost their prime minister the other day.
What happened there?
The Stanford alum, who was the prime minister of the UK, lost in just an election slam down to an Oxford grad. So no more Stanford tree at 10 Downing Street. But anyways, it's just kind of a fun kind of number to look at.
Absolutely. It's fun. You've expanded this deep dive.
Yeah, we added a little more for the last couple. Just some other things that I just, again, because what I wanted to give you guys a sense of is really, again, like I said, how these things relate, like how, the football drives the donations, which drives the budget, which drives the independence from the state government. I mean, all that stuff plays a role. And for example, one of the things you'll hear about, for example, you hear people say our tax dollar. Well, first of all, Michigan's tax dollars aren't going to the University of Michigan. They only get 3% from the state. Now, and remember, here's the crazy thing. Everybody's tax dollars help pay for, again, the research money, that like advances our science and society, really, really good spending is often very heavily driven by the government. And so it's funny. I've done some charts. Some of you guys may have seen it before, where the private schools get more total taxpayer dollars than a lot of the public schools. And if you count things like the military student tuition that like Liberty and Maryland and Purdue get, those numbers just start to go crazy. Particularly again, the people that are doing like the GI Bill and the DoD tuition reimbursement programs, like they're getting a lot of money from the government, way more so than schools that than public schools do. The other interesting thing when you guys look at this data, there's one weird conference, and I've been working with a couple of Division III schools on some stuff, and it's fascinating to see. Yeah. The UAA, which is like, it's kind of like the Ivy League of Division III, but it's NYU, Brandeis, University of Chicago, Washington, University in St. Louis, that whole group. And they're insane because they're like, there's schools like Northwestern. NYU has 70,000 students or something crazy, and it's budget up there with UCLA, and they're running Division III programs. And so like NYU has started to do new things like, hey, they want to be good at sports again. So they're like, let's go get the swimmers from Alabama who want to go to med school and have a COVID year. Oh, hey, look, we just won the national championship again. What do you know? Our swimmers from Alabama. Yes, there's some cool stuff going on in some of those other divisions. Again, where the funny thing is, they're like Big Ten schools on Division III budgets, and so they do things like have lavish vans to take their like club sport athletes to weekend meets and stuff like that. It's pretty fun.
And I got to say, Tony, my first dip into the professional world of journalism and broadcasting was right out of college. And my first job was as a news reporter and anchor at a very small TV station in Ashland, Ohio, which also was a big, giant country music radio station. And Ashland University, at Division III school, there was a huge scandal dealing with money, given to recruits and athletes, and just I was enlightened to that type of behavior, that type of conduct at that level. I just didn't think it was worth it, and didn't think that those programs cared enough, and because the gain, the risk versus the reward just didn't seem worth it, that they would go to those measures.
Well, I mean, I love when you read the old articles, which could have been written or I guess Tennessee went to the court and got rid of the rules. But when you read the stories of like 1850s rowing contests with legit NIL money, these kids were doing marketing work. And all kinds of shady. They're like, oh, we're gonna send them all on vacation to Cuba. And it's like in the Spanish Empire, or whatever. Like, and you're looking at it and you're laughing. You're like, these are the same issues we deal with today. Only this is before the Civil War, and it's like Harvard versus Cornell rowing on Lake Champlain because football hadn't been invented yet. And there are a lot of the same scandals we deal with today.
Yes, there's nothing new under the sun.
No, well, there's a great one of the old commissioners of the Ivy League, I think, said once something like, "There's no problem in college sports that we didn't invent." But again, it's one of the interesting things here is I love looking at this deep dive universe, because you really are just looking at this sort of group of schools against their peers. And to schools, guys, I don't know if you guys know this, most schools publish a peer list, and that's who they compare themselves to. So I have a call on Monday. I'm helping a smaller Division II school, and we've broken down and done a ton of analysis for them on how they compare against their peers, against their conference, against the average. And it's interesting to really take a look at, again, how the schools view themselves in terms of peers. And so looking at this gives us a sense of doing that as well.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I enjoy these every time. Love the comparison. Knew that this one was going to be a good one, and certainly an elite one in just about every category. And certainly Michigan has established itself as a academic giant. And from what little I know, and you can correct me, Tony, but Ohio State's made great strides in recent decades on that front. But Michigan, of course, has been an elite academic institution from
they both are elite. I mean, I would argue one of the things that Michigan has that allows them to do what they do is Michigan State. Because the thing about these schools is they all have a mission to serve. Like Ohio State is very big on the idea that they are the state. They are the reason they call themselves the Ohio State. And of course, Mark knows this better than anybody, but they call themselves the Ohio State University because they believe that they are the state university of Ohio, and that they owe a mission to the state to take care of their state. and it's part of being a land grant. They just had, I think, I can't remember if they had the Tennessee chancellor, if she had them for like a conference on like what it means to be a land grant school and how to serve your state. Michigan's not the land grant school of Michigan. And I would argue that Michigan having Michigan State to fill that mission lets Michigan, sort of, lollygag off into the Ivy realms a little bit, because Michigan State is there serving that mission to the state. And California set themselves up with like that on purpose, by the way, guys. If you guys don't know that, they set themselves up with the UC schools doing their thing, and the Cal State schools doing their thing, and the JC schools doing their thing in 1960. And it's sort of a structure that serves that. But Ohio State has always sort of been like, we are in Texas too, we are the school of Ohio, and we are here to take care of our students. So I give Ohio State credit for that.
Tony, thank you so much as always. In recent days, and also in looking at the chat, as you have reviewed the numbers, I've determined that if I want to dedicate myself to more shows and more content, two things that I may do would be, number one is watch our Michigan show, which is on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We've now got a call-in show on Thursday that I don't take part in, but I host the Ohio State show. But it would only be fair if I did this with both, that I would hold a post show, Tony. So I would host
post show. I like it.
Show, and I would fact check the chat.
I will watch that every time.
The accuracy rate isn't quite what I would like it to be.
It's better than our political discourse, so I'll take that.
Yeah, I would say that.
I'll take it.
That's a sad commentary, but yes,
I'll take the Buckeye fan. I love when the Buckeye fans get going after the Michigan fans. It makes it fun.
And then the other thing that came to mind in watching this, I would love to hold a show between Ohio State and Michigan fans, and this would be the one rule in the chat. All Ohio State fans, when making an opinionated comment, all Ohio State fans are required to say something positive about Michigan, and all Michigan fans are required to say something positive about Ohio State, or else they get booted from the chat.
I like that, but I actually think that would be doable. So I don't know if you guys watching, I don't know if you guys know this. I grew up in Michigan. We found out that my dad got Lloyd Carr drunk for the first time when he was an 18-year-old high school senior quarterback staying with my dad at Michigan State. And so, I grew up with Michigan and Michigan State, and grew up with a Buckeye grandpa. And so, I love both of these schools, and I think they're both incredible places, and everybody who is a fan of either one should be really proud. But I'll tell you that the moment that stood out to me more than anything about these two schools was when Bo Schembechler passed away, and the reverence with which because he was a Buckeye as well, and dear friend with Woody Hayes, but the reverence that both of these they don't want to let you know it, but the reverence that both of these fan bases hold for each other, I think says a lot.
Yeah, and that's a great anecdote right there to go to summarize that in one event, because there was respect. Of course, the Michigan nation was in mourning, and the Ohio State nation was of
saluting and respect.
Yes, out of his contribution to the rivalry, and of course to Michigan, and for the intensity of that rivalry as it's been through the years, but specifically in the 1970s during the 10-year war between Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler, there is not much that neither one of them would not have done for the other. They were extremely close, and they certainly proved that through the years in the charitable acts and the different
things they did for each other.
Acts of kindness, yes, that they did for each other.
Absolutely. I mean, my dad's huge coaching rival was one of his best friends, and we who is also like dear friend of our family. So game week, of course, he never came over to the house. but other weeks always would. And the Connor Stallions thing made me laugh because, of course, there wasn't rules against it. So, I mean, there's people angrily typing in the chat, I'm sure, about this, but oh yeah, they would absolutely like give each other anything they needed to beat the teams that they really hated.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Tony, thank you so much. It was great to have you here as always, and we thank you so much for providing these for all these various teams.
Always glad to help.
We've got Nebraska and Iowa, hopefully, that we're going to be able to get together here at some point in the next month or so.
Oh, that'll be a ferocious fight in the chat.
So we will get after that one.
Yeah, and Nebraska is interesting. I'll tell you guys one thing I do in these numbers when you guys see them, just real quick. I don't want to keep Mark, but I look at these schools and I think it's dumb to not count their med schools, to not count the information from their med schools, particularly like when we do count it for Penn State. But Penn State's is like, I don't know, 2.5 hours away from their school or something. Nebraska's is like an hour away. We count Penn State's, we don't count Nebraska. Texas, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And so schools like Texas, Tennessee, Nebraska, on these numbers, I give them back their med schools because it's their med school. Like they view it as theirs. What's funny
that decision on whether to count it.
So it has to do with the where the actual sort of management of it lies. And so like does the head of that campus run the med school? And so like at Penn State, like the president of Penn State is considered the president. So it's yes. At Nebraska, technically there's a chancellor of Nebraska Lincoln and a president of the University of Nebraska. The chancellor of Nebraska Lincoln doesn't run the med school. However, the athletic department reports above him to the president anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And you get some wackiness with that. The funny thing is, by the way, nobody ever complains when I add Tennessee and Texas Tech because I think it's wrong to do them back in. But everybody complains about Texas. But I've had executives from Texas tell me it's our med school, so you probably should count it. Actually, it's plural because there's 4 of them, but yeah. They have 4 med schools that are sort of separate from the school itself. And that doesn't even count the UTSA ones. So, again, it's a whole interesting thing, but it's yours. It's you. It's part of you. I think it should count it. The 2 that are wacky are Oregon and Georgia, where they took the med school away and made it a different school. So Georgia, it's now called Augusta, and they have like a really good men's golf team and stuff like that. And Oregon, it's called OHSU, the Oregon Health and Sciences Universities, but it's a separate thing for now completely. So I don't count those, but I always think if it is part of your school, we should count it.
Yeah, that is really swaying some of these numbers, and I would love for somebody to get a handle on that and make it justified and valid across the board.
And that's why I put them both for you guys. I shade on the ones I shade the ones that count differently. But just as Michigan's really proud of its med school and its medical empire, so is Texas. The one wacky one too, the other wacky one, sorry, the wacky one I forgot, which gets really fussy about. And AD has zinged me for this on Twitter before, but Alabama's med school is at UAB. UAB is part of Alabama, or part of the University of Alabama, but it's where the city stuff and all the research and all the medical stuff and all that. And they don't do, and Tuscaloosa or Huntsville, Alabama. The University of Alabama, Huntsville is where they do all the NASA research stuff, but they don't do any of it. They do almost nothing in Tuscaloosa. So if you look at the numbers, it's like, does Alabama have 100 million or 1.2 billion? Depends how you count it. So they're all kind of complicated, but I try to give them to you guys in ways that are easy to understand and then break it out where we need to.
Great stuff, Tony.
Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
I appreciate it. Tony, have a good night.
You too. Go Blue and go Bucks.
Tony Altamore doing a heck of a job for us once again, as we have come to expect on the deep dive Ohio State and Michigan. I'll probably put up a condensed version of this and trim out everything else, post that on the Ohio State and Michigan channels in case that you've dropped in a little bit late. You can go back and catch what you missed right here, or again, I intend on posting these with just the Ohio State and Michigan content on the Ohio State and Michigan channels, which brings me to Buckeyes Live, showing up on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the Ohio State channel. So join me, Steve, Tony, and Kevin on the Ohio State channel. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday. We've got an Oklahoma Sooners Live at 1 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. I believe that's the extent of the live shows. How could I forget? Of course, we've got a Michigan call-in show at 8 o'clock. So it's Ohio State, it's Oklahoma, it's Michigan live shows on Thursday. Also, keep in mind, Steve Dace and I got together for a record today. We talked his power rankings, every conference. We went pretty deep on Michigan and the Big Ten. So that's going to be posted right here, premiering in the morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Steve Dace and myself, again, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, premiering right here on the Voice of College Football. Check out the conversation, number of them that we had today. So please, again, check out the videos. We are ramping it up here at the Voice of College Football. In addition, Realignment Week continues, and I appreciate the response. Many of the videos pushing 10,000 views. So thank you so much for that on Realignment. We've got a couple more coming. We've got Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football recording with him tomorrow. He's going to give us the rundown on Wake. And also Tony is in court reviewing these cases with Clemson against the ACC, with Florida State against the ACC. So he's giving us firsthand accounts of these court battles between the ACC and Clemson and Florida State. So we're going to get a rundown on that as well. And again, where the ACC could be headed. Check out my video, which is kind of a worst case scenario turnaround to a best case scenario for the ACC, in that the biggest exodus followed by the biggest procurement of their current schools, retaining those commodities, but going out and possibly plucking some, a la what the Big 12 has done in recent years. Thank you for being here, the Voice of College Football. Please hit the like button on the way out, and we will see you Thursday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the Ohio State channel for Buckeyes Live.